here. This thing is called A Critique of the Political Economy of Capitalist Prehistory. And I wanted to start with two quotations. The first one's from Furio Yesi, which goes like this: normal time is not only a bourgeois concept, but the outcome of a bourgeois manipulation of time. It guarantees bourgeois society a calm endurance. And the second one is from Alain Badiou, and it runs like this: the rarity of revolutionary success is an absolutely proven fact, and it is the reason why we consider ourselves to be living in prehistory. On the 12th of September 1940, something surprising happened to robots. So that you do not think I'm crazy. Robot was the name of a dog, which was owned by the then 18-year-old Marcel Ravida, who by accident, examining a hole left by an uprooted tree, discovered the so-called Lascaux cave, which is a network of caves near the village of Montignac in the department of Dordogne in the southwest of France. In it, one finds 600 wall paintings that include 6,000 figures, mainly animals, human figures, and abstract signs. In the early 1950s, Georges Bataille got interested in prehistory, and more precisely in prehistoric art, and even more precisely in the paintings that can be found in the very Lascaux cave. A cave, as rumor has it, that made Picasso, after visiting it, exclaim, "In 15,000 years, we have invented nothing." It is not unremarkable that Bataille, a philosopher who also claimed that philosophy's task, its true purpose, is to grasp the major aspects of a given historical moment or shift, that was a citation, displayed an immense interest in the prehistoric artifacts newly discovered. So this discovery, i.e. the encounter with prehistoric art, must from Bataille's perspective have allowed to grasp a major aspect of a given or an established historical shift. What was this shift that appears linked to the discovery or even invention of prehistory or the prehistoric? In a lecture given at the Society of Agriculture and Literature and Art in Orléans in December 1952, Bataille gives an answer. He there begins by stating, "He who says prehistory says history." This point seems trivial, overly trivial, but is more complex than it seems. Obviously, and without a doubt, we literally say history when we pronounce the word prehistory. But what else, what more do we say when we say it? For Bataille, what is new, the surplus that emerged with the discovery of prehistory, is that it allows us, or something that allows us to make a difference between prehistory and history. But what does it mean to make this difference? This very difference for Bataille is linked to another difference, notably a difference that pertains to and manifests in the relationship between the human being and the animal. The difference between prehistory and history, therefore, Bataille argues, can be identified with two ways of treating the difference between the human and the animal. In what we call history, human beings have established themselves as so fundamentally different from animals that, I quote Bataille, "We send animals to slaughterhouses and we hardly blink an eye," unquote. And even though humans have done atrocious things to other humans, there's still a fundamental difference between human to human violence and human to animal violence. This is because, quote Bataille again, "for a human being, there is a discontinuity, a fundamental difference between an animal and himself," unquote. But it is prehistory that allows to account for how this fundamental difference in human self-understanding is established in the first place. And it is exactly here that Bataille's reflections become a little more interesting. For what the discovery of the Lascaux cave paintings allows to conjecture for Bataille is that prehistoric man, I quote again, confronted the animal, not as though he were confronting an inferior being or a thing, a negligible reality, but as if he were confronting a mind similar to his own, unquote. This does not only account for what Bataille describes as a magical character that the cave images have in relation to the hunt, since the animal prey they depict is represented in his words, in such admirable ways, unquote, whereas they used childish techniques to represent man, from which follows for Bataille that men only really mattered in relation to the animals that were hunted, and they admired what they hunted. This means there was no hostility or hatred in their relationship. But there's another observation that Bataille makes, and this seems to me the most crucial one. Namely, and I'm citing, "The man on the wall in Lascaux has the head of a bird. That is, he is disguised as an animal. He's wearing a mask. Thus, the Lascaux man affirmed his humanity the way the most cultivated man does. The man defined himself to be the king of animals, but also he concealed this humanity behind an animal mask." It's both at the same time. What Bataille is here describing is that the proper humanity of mankind emerges precisely when man disguised herself as an animal. The prehistoric man of the Lascaux cave painting prepares thereby the very ground of the very condition of possibility of the difference between human beings and the animals by making a difference appear and disappear at the same time. Put differently, here we encounter a representation of the moment, that the moment human beings can act as if they're animals, or the moment that human beings act as if they're animals, they're no longer animals. That's the point that Bataille meant. Well, to put it again differently, if we are here dealing with so-called primitive man, as Bataille puts it, the appropriation of the appearance of the animal is a literal act of primitive accumulation that is constitutive of mankind as mankind. So we appropriate the appearance, the form of appearance of the animal, so that we can disguise ourselves as animals. And that is what makes mankind appear. The difference that the mask of the animal introduces is a minimal difference, but it changes everything. It makes humanity emerge from a difference as an animal that can relate to its own animality, and thereby introduces a difference into animality itself. Since it is a difference that emerges through a peculiar redoubling of the animal within the animal world itself. Since Bataille does here not describe how one splits one into two, as in the famous Maoist motto, but rather how one divides itself with itself, to cite one of the master thinkers present in the room tonight, I'm continuing citing him, it introduces its non-coincidence with itself. In line with Bataille and Zizek, I spoiled it if you didn't figure it out right, Hegel once remarked that human beings are historical beings because they know that they're animal beings, and due to this very knowledge, they are more than just animals. In Hegel's language, they cease to be animals, because they elevate their being animal into an object of science, of nutrition, for example, or and investigate their digestion and stuff like that. In different words, when the animal can indicate it is an animal, it's no longer an animal. When the slaves indicate they're slaves, they're no longer just slaves. A minimal difference is inscribed that changes things. Bataille's point is thus that, I quote, while generally the representation of humans is rare in Upper Paleolithic art, so there is something exceptional to this specific Lascaux cave painting, it is nevertheless where, I quote, the passage from animal to man, as he calls it in another text, can be detected. It is, I quote again, the man who painted himself as an animal who ceased being an animal by painting these images. It is crucial to note the bidirectionality of the move introduced here. We're not simply progressing in any way from the animal to the human, but rather by masking herself as an animal, the human as human is represented. And it is this bidirectionality, this bidirectional difference, that explains why whoever says prehistory says history. This must also mean that the difference between prehistory and history implies actually three terms. The animals, the prehistory that establishes the difference between the animals and the human beings through humans disguising themselves as animals, and thereby allows for history, and then also the hierarchical difference between animals and humans. Elsewhere, Bataille gives another formulation of this and claims that, I quote, indifference is proper to the animal. Which means we could possibly indicate that we here encounter a progressivist model that moves from indifference to the condition of possibility of a difference to an actualization of this possibility. Animal kingdom, or what he, with a, I think, very nice formulation reminiscent of Hegel, calls the night of animality. Prehistory and then history. But it seems to me that things are again a little more complex here, or complicated. Because difference emerges, if we take Bataille's formulation seriously, within the realm of animal indifference by a redoubling of indifference, and hence a split within indifference occurs such that we get from indifference to a being indifference to indifference, and it is this being indifference to indifference that allows for the establishing of an actual difference. With the difference between prehistory and history, we thus encounter all the ontological complications that pertain to what was often referred to in the 20th century as ontologies of difference. Bataille's Leia model, for he thinks that the concept of prehistory gives us an insight into what he calls the universal history par excellence. Indifference, being indifference to indifference, and difference, which will ultimately, at the end, lead to another form of indifference, and thus go full circle, but I leave the last step aside for our purposes. But he also tries to assume that the emergence of history is the emergence of the very concept of what he calls the thing. And since, I quote him, for primitive human beings the animal is not a thing, unquote, he writes, the thing is on the side of humanity. And this cannot but mean on the side of history. Humanity is coincidental with doing, with creating, with inventing the thing, with creating something that is unavoidably not there, because before it has been created. And this thing might actually be what history is all about. Bataille describes it in terms of a loss of what he calls a decisive virtue, a creative virtue that primitive man still had. The thing might be the animal, but it does not have to be. The animal's kind of a stand-in for that, right? So humanity is on the side of the thing. And I think it's quite a good formula to keep in mind, since the very idea of the thing, of das Ding, is invented with history itself. So in this sense, history is thing history for Bataille. History is the thing. Hegel will say that history is all about facts, Tatsachen, and Tatsachen are not only literally things done, acts that become facts, but they are also deed things, deeds that generate Sachen, things, and objective circumstances. The deed is das Ding, so to speak. For as Hegel states, I quote Hegel now, natural life is indeed subordinate to time and solely brings finite things into existence, similar to how also the prehistoric days of a people that only forms a nation, a tribe, but does not form a state and does not pursue ends that are stable in themselves, will be subject to the ahistorical violence of time. So there's a time that is ahistorical. It is ahistorical when it is nothing but merely chronological, a succession of nows. Natural life is subordinate to time because nothing in it withstands time. Its entire organization is dictated by the pre-existing temporal flow and is thus determined by something else than itself. The ahistorical violence of time is time without historicity proper, and prehistory is thus, for Hegel, the absence of historical time through the overpresence of chronological time. We talked about this in the seminar. History proper only appears, similar to what Bataille argued, when a difference in time emerges, when a difference to the indifference of time emerges, when we are indifferent to the indifference of the natural flow of time. Or in other words, history proper only emerges when something appears within time that withstands time, that in time falls out of time, that is in time more than time itself, or maybe is exactly thereby time itself, and is thereby able to change time from mere chronology to history, as if from flow to short circuit. Hegel states that, I quote again, The term history unites the objective with the subjective sides and denotes equally what has happened as it does the narration of what has happened. He's thus, end of quote, he's thus indicating that something without any form of symbolization is not going to be a historical event. This means that history is not and never just objective. Time passes, but history is made. It is made not only objectively, but through subjective mediation. It demands subjective action and intervention that manifest in an objective manner. So the paradox, or circuit, we encounter here is that subjective symbolization of historical events can only symbolize what is an objective historical event, which will only have been an objective historical event if it is subjectively symbolized as such. To refer this back to what Bataille's argument is, the possibility of history emerges in prehistory precisely when animality, when indifference appears as a mask, appears as something that is made, that is produced, but disguises itself, or in different words, the conditions of possibility of history appear within prehistory when agents disguise themselves as being outside of history. So they disguise themselves as non-historical agents. And that is the moment when there is a possibility of history. I want to argue in the following that this peculiar economy of difference that is constitutive of historicity and that I just very schematically depicted is what allows for the operationalization of this difference in a capitalist political economy. It allows for it because I think capitalism does not simply thrive on difference, including the difference between the animal and the human, but it does work with this difference in a peculiar way. Paolo Virno, and as some students in this room will know, we discussed this, has, for example, argued that capitalism does not only work because there is a difference between labor power and actual labor, but rather it has turned this very difference into an object and resource of its own movement. The slogan that Virno generates for this is capitalism historicizes meta-history. So it brings into an objective grasp the very conditions of possibility of history. Or in different terms, Virno argues that capitalism has made the difference between a potential act and an actual action itself into an object. And that is called labor power, which is then possibly bought and can be put to use whenever it's fortuitous. And Vernon claims that objectifying and commodifying this difference is precisely where the particular surplus capitalism thrives on springs from. But I think we even might venture a slightly different reading and claim, again in the words of Slavoj Žižek, that labor power, I'm quoting now, as commodity has the paradoxical character of producing more value than it is itself worth, unquote. Then it is exactly this, because it's exactly this strange division of one into itself and itself, this internal self-division that capitalism seems to thrive on and objectivizes into a source of value. As you may see, we're slowly approaching the critique of political economy. But why does this critique of political economy have any relationship to prehistory? Well, one of Marx's well-known, most referenced, most cited, most reiterated formulations appears in the famous last part of the introduction of the contribution to the critique of political economy, which was written in 1858 and published in 1859. It appears, so to speak, in the last stage of the prehistory of Marx's works that precede Capital. Yet at the same time, because the contribution is the first properly published form of this very critique of political economy, this citation I have in mind appears in the passage out of the prehistoric mode, so to speak. Marx there describes what he calls the bourgeois mode of production as the final, letzte, formation with which, quote, the prehistory of human society closes. Mit dieser Formation schließt daher die Vorgeschichte der menschlichen Gesellschaft ab. And everyone who is in my course has heard this already a number of times. But so human history has a prehistory. Marx articulates this in the very same introduction by recourse to the sequence of other modes of production that he calls Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes. But I will leave this aside for tonight. The starting point of my reflections is rather that we are, according to Marx's claim, to this specific claim, still living in prehistory, and therefore Marx's critique of political economy cannot but be a critique of the political economy of a prehistoric mode of production. The closure in all its semantic dimensions, end, finalization, conclusion, completion, Abschluss of this prehistory is the beginning of human society and therefore also of proper human history. Hence, the beginning of history, historicity proper, implies an end. The closing and closure, the finalization and completion, the conclusion and ending of prehistory of mankind, or if you like, of the pre-human norm history or human prehistory. Marx's project is therefore a project that aims at identifying the structure and modus operandi of this very prehistory. But since, as you know, he described the critique of political economy, or more precisely his Capital, which bears this very same subtitle, in a letter from 1867 to Johann Becker as, I quote, "without question, the most terrible missile that has yet been hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie," unquote. His project is also what therefore can be characterized as presenting the concluding remarks on as the explosion of capitalism as prehistory. So I'm trying to suggest the identification of prehistory as prehistory does already do something to our relationship to prehistory. What I mean by this is that it seems that the critique of political economy could be interpreted as taking on the mask of the animal. It is looking at the world through the lens of political economy that sees only economic animals, everywhere, in the first place, and therefore provides what is nowadays often declared to be an immanent critique of it. So Marx does. But maybe it is important to emphasize more that Marx is taking on the mask of the political economist and is therefore making a difference. This is not totally off, I think, with regard to the images that Marx himself uses, since in a passage that he redacted from the first volume of Capital, he noted when speaking of money that, I quote, and some of you know that very well, "it is as if, alongside and external to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form, when grouped together, the various kinds, species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, there existed, in addition, the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom." Unquote. Money is the animal, the individual incarnation of the animal kingdom, that is capitalism. It is its concrete universal embodiment in a singular thing. But it is here important to emphasize the minimal difference. Money is not disguising itself as an animal. It is the animal. It is the animal. It is exactly the meaningless addition of an abstract entity which makes the whole thing work. Money then becomes the abstract empty thing, the animal which exploits the differences between the animal and the animals, which know that it is that they are animals and thereby is different from just being an animal. Labor power and money, therefore, correspond. This cannot but mean that for a critique of the political economy of capitalist prehistory, we have to change the mask, the minimal difference. Capitalism thrives on making the difference between the animal and itself work for it. Marx's critique of capitalist political economy could therefore appear to be a form of a cave painting exercise. Capitalism itself can certainly be understood as a cave, almost in the Platonic sense, and just imagine someone cave painting in the background behind those captured by the moving shadows and those carrying stuff along. Right? Imagine Marx to do that, just painting stuff. We put on the mask of the animal and thereby attempt to mark a difference vis-à-vis the very mode of masking. Note that Marx, for example, describes the personifications of economic processes, like the condensations, the capitalist and the proletarians or the workers as character masks. But why should capitalism be prehistoric in the first place? Because, as Marx has indicated, the project of the critique of political economy is one which focuses on the forms of domination specific to capitalism, which become increasingly impersonal, because they are forms of domination that operates through organizing and determining the temporality of time, or time itself. It is thereby a particular mode of the production of an absorption of historical time. So capitalism absorbs historical time. It produces the absorption of historical time. For Marx clearly states in the Grundrisse that all economy dissolves in an economy of time, and the German formula for that is, darin löst sich schließlich alle Ökonomie auf. So really all economy is dissolved in an economy of time. And hence the critique of the capitalist mode of production cannot but be a critique of the capitalist mode of the production of an absorption of historical time, or differently put, it cannot but be a critique of the way the capitalist mode of production is and remains prehistoric. So I'm trying to say what capitalism does is it undoes the very possibility of historical transformation by absorbing temporality, producing the absorption of temporality. In it, because it is an economy and hence an organization of time, we encounter history without events. Geschichte ohne Ereignisse, as Marx claimed in the 18th Brumaire. We could say history without history or historicity, so sequences, I quote, apparently only driven forward by the calendar and made wearisome by the constant repetition of the same tensions and relaxations. History running on empty, naturalizing time, a convulsive movement of time that does not move anywhere, a convulsion of historicity, producing transformations without transformations, moving forward while being stuck in going backwards, or just in being stuck, as if dialectics running on empty, not only in stillstand, but stillstand in place of the or a dialectic. But things are certainly quite complicated here already, since in the terms used by Marx in the Grundrisse, Kapital, capital, is beständige, continual, permanent, lasting, enduring revolution. That, I quote, strives to annihilate space by means of time. So a peculiar kind of revolution that dominates and oppresses by being stuck in a process of constant revolutionizing. A revolution that never revolutionizes the very form of the revolution and revolutionizes everything by means of this form. This form that remains stable and allows for stable organization is the form of capitalist time itself. This is what I'm trying to say. Revolution in this form itself becomes Beständigkeit, an invariance, a fixity, a Bestand, an inventory, arsenal, or simply a stock. It is a non-revolution undoing of revolution by means of repetition and revolution. Not by hysterically repeating the revolution, even of the form of revolution, but rather by repeating a strangely repetitive modus non revolutionarii. This implies, as Amy E. Wendling has, for example, argued, that one is dealing with a very specific temporal register that allows for the arrestation or the suspension of historicity. These were her words, arrestation and suspension. This is maybe a form of what Benjamin called homogeneous and empty time. And that must also lead to an analysis of capitalism's advancement through regression, through non-productive, non-creative destruction of historicity, often by means of creative destruction of eventuality. Wendling describes the former temporality of bourgeois revolution as that of hoarding, of time itself, and can certainly remind us of what Marx says about hoarding in Capital. Whereas the proletarian revolution must have a different temporality. She calls it temporality of distillation, since they create situations of impossibility and work with that very impossibility. Class struggle thus seems to be a class struggle about historical temporality itself, about temporality, about different types of temporality. Not only about the length of the working day, certainly that as well, but also about history, what counts as historical, and therefore about historicity itself. This has implications for the temporal economies and economic temporalities involved. Just recall the paradigmatic passage from the Communist Manifesto. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but the means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist societies, the present dominates the past. Unquote. There is, and this is the stuckness of repetition and the repetition in stuckness, a form of domination that articulates itself as temporal dominance of the past over the present. Since the history, or as Engels stated, the prehistory of all societies, he added a footnote to the Communist Manifesto and basically said, well, the first sentence, the history of all societies, we should be more precise and basically say it's the prehistory of all societies that has been the history of class struggle. Bourgeois societies are constitutively living in the past, and that is the prehistory claim. They are the past of life, the past of the living, since they organize only the passing, the past of life. There are at least, I think, 3 reasons for that inversions, at least when it comes to the Communist Manifesto. First, this is because when the present and its constitution is entirely determined and dominated by the ways in which the past organized itself and by the forms of expression and reflection, thought and action, then the present is dominated by some kind of natural temporality in the form that Hegel described. It is nothing but a restaging, a repetition of the past, and this is carried on into the future that in some way has already started to determine us. So in some sense, saying we're living in the past means we're living already in our future, because the future will just be like the past. This is why changing this structure necessitates creating a new past, or in Marx's words, to create, I quote, what is newest in what is oldest. Second, the reason why there is a preponderance of the past over the present is not only because of a similar structure repeating itself constantly, but also because everything in a capitalist social formation is articulated in a specific form, notably the form of private property. That's the main claim of the manifesto. And private property is the presence of the past of labor. That's the language that the manifesto uses. That is hereditarily transmitted through the form of the family. And this transmission is protected by the military, or in more abstract terms, by the state. Third, the third way in which the past determines the present in prehistoric capitalist formations is by way of presenting bourgeois society as the only natural environment of freedom. The only way that is adequate to free men, and this is even already explicit in Adam Smith, as Michael Heinrich has shown, who emphasizes that that for Smith, man is an animal that cannot but exchange. Man is an exchanging animal for Adam Smith. That's the assumption. Thereby, it turns the law of bourgeois society into what Heinrich calls an eternal law of nature and of reason, slightly modifying Marx there. These 3 dimensions, temporal organization, material condition, and naturalization, can be seen to constitute what Marx, in the Civil War in France calls the prejudice of the past, Vorurteil der Vergangenheit, and you should hear the pre in the prejudice, right? The pre in the prejudice indicates the predominance of the past over the present, and thus is an index of prehistory. This kind of prejudice allows for what Massimiliano Tomba once called the eternalization of bourgeois categories. When Marx states in the critique of the Gotha program that it is an important task to, I quote, prove concretely how in present capitalist society the material etc. conditions have at last been created which enable and compel the workers to lift the historical curse, unquote. What could this mean in the context that we're talking about? It seems to me, if there's any proper task for the critique of political economy of a prehistoric formation, it lies in demonstrating that this formation is indeed prehistoric. It lies in identifying prehistory as prehistory. And more precisely, in identifying the condition it relies on and that make it prehistoric. So the conditions of possibility of prehistory, which in their very constitutions prove to be the conditions of impossibility of history. And so I'm toying with this Derridian formula a tiny little bit, that the conditions of possibility of prehistory coincide with the conditions of impossibility of history. The task thus just lies in grasping the very structure or modality, or indeed the conditions that move in the rest, that constitute and reproduce the prehistoric formation that is the bourgeois mode of production. It is crucial to extrapolate and articulate their stuckness laws in slight modification of what Marx calls the study of the laws of movement of the capitalist mode of production. To cut a long story short, such a program cannot but entail looking at two things, unfolding two almost parallel histories, and both are not what I will be able to present to you in most detail this evening, even though both are crucial for such a project. The first part, about which I can say only very few things, but nevertheless, and I think it's linked to the way in which the French Revolution remained for Marx an incomplete revolution, is the actual coming into being of the capitalist mode of production in comparison and in difference with other modes of production. And the complication is that the implementation of capitalism is not a single event. I mean, that's what we sometimes, or what one could think, right? It just like was other stuff, and then bam, there was capitalism. But it's rather implemented through repeated reinstatements of primitive accumulation, as Rosa Luxemburg, I think, pointed out and has argued, or through repeated forms of appropriation by dispossession, as David Harvey argued. But they will have to be temporalized or understood in exactly the way in which they come into being. But this, in the end, contributes to an overall, I think, critical understanding of how the capitalist mode of production operates as a prehistoric formation. My interpretative wager does not come from Marx directly, but will help elucidate, I think, why capitalism is prehistoric. The way I think one can do this is by substantiating the claim that capitalism, A, is a way of organizing time, such that history and historicity disappears, and the form of chronological time, natural time, dominates. The very modus operandi of bourgeois time economy establishes a specific mode of production of temporality that I take to be a production of an absorption of historical time, a mode of time suspension. Capitalism, in this sense, is prehistoric because it is an organization, to put it differently, of the consumption of time. This means, inter alia, that in capitalism we're literally consuming time when we're consuming its elementary form, the commodity. I mean, it's trivial, right? I mean, what else should be in it? As Marx claims in Capital, all commodities are merely definite quantities of congealed labor time. Unquote. Capitalism establishes and reproduces a form of historicity that it fixes and fixates, so that, in a sense, capitalism, by being a prefix to history, is prefixing history, prehistorical fixing, and thereby arresting of historicity, prefixing itself as prehistory. I'm saying that again because I read it really crappily.
History repeats itself.
Yeah, exactly. Capitalism establishes and reproduces a form of historicity that it fixes and fixates, so that, in a sense, capitalism, by being a prefix to history, for Marx, is prefixing history, prehistorical fixing, and thereby arresting of historicity, prefixing itself as prehistory. That was...
You did it.
Yes.
Nailed it.
Oh dear. Even though capital seems to move everything, and even though it melts everything solid into steam, literally in German it's not into thin air, it's Dampf, because it's a reference to Dampfmaschine. That one thing that moves everything ultimately remains an unmoved mover. Its laws are natural, and I venture I venture to claim that in this sense at least, capital is Aristotelian. Stuckness thus occurs with regard to the very form of the movement of the automatic subject in Marx's parlance, that is the movement of capital, that is value begetting more value in the movement of its realization. Let me briefly make this claim in 3 steps, and some people who discussed with me the last couple of days know that I have been obsessing about this. First, the automatic subject, so Marx calls capital the automatic subject in Grundrisse. First, the automatic subject is what organizes the entirety of society, and it is capital. It is not a substance, but a repetitive movement. It is dead and alive at the same time. Second, the subject that makes history thus has no substance, because it is nothing but what it does. It is only its own action, to speak Hegelese. So Hegel says the subject is only what it makes of itself. And hence, it is in this sense desubstantialized. Third, yet the very form of its movement, the form of desubstantialization, is substantialized, and there is no way that it could therefore ever change. We thus here encounter a substantialization on the level of the very form of movement, or put differently, we encounter here a stuckness in movement, or this is the production of the absorption of historical time. No history can ever affect this form of movement. And this is what constitutes, I think, capitalism as prehistoric. That it's unable to touch that exactly, that very form. The real question is thus what enables this type of stuckness on this level, as the substantialization of the desubstantialization, as I put it in quite technical terms, must have some material equivalent. Marx makes a similar point when he addresses that the laws of capital movement appear to be natural laws, obey what he calls an iron necessity, and why he argues that he presents the, I quote, process of natural history, naturgeschichtlichen Prozess, of capitalist society, and claims even that, I quote again, it is the ultimate aim of this work, capital, to reveal the economic laws of motion of modern society, and for him this means, quote again, the natural law of its movement. The natural law of its movement. So all the stuff I emphasized about naturalization, right, this is why I emphasized. Capitalism in this sense is prehistoric because it has naturalized itself, generates what the early Marx once called, with a, I think, absolutely amazing term, a dream history. A term which should be given, I think, almost all the Freudian weight. So all I've said implies capitalism organizes time in such a way that it does away with it. If prehistoric history, to quote a very paradoxical expression from Hegel, he calls it prehistoric history, introduces what, again, Hegel introduces a kingdom of duration, unquote. This enables me to link, I think, these reflections thus far to some rather recent conceptual claims made by Alain Badiou. He endorses the idea that we're still living under what he calls Neolithic conditions, and that those conditions established between 10 to 5,000 years ago still have a determining effect on our social interaction and organization. The Neolithic age is what follows what historians obviously call prehistory, but therefore might still be in line with with why Marx says capitalism is the last stage of the prehistoric formations, right? So what are these conditions of the Neolithic age for Badiou? For him, he goes as far to say it is somehow the only true revolution thus far. It is the actual beginning of history, that's a quote, preceded by a time when small nomadic groups were hunters and gatherers who lived from what they encountered, whereas from the moment of the Neolithic age, we encounter a sedentary culture which allows for the stocking of things and for a class living of them, and hence for social hierarchy, private property of land. We have a state with some kind of state organization, with a military force to protect owners of private property. We encounter forms of family organization that are subordinate to certain laws, mainly for him to that of hereditary transmission of property. A bit later, writing is invented, which allows to keep registers of who has what, who did what, who owes what. There are slowly nations emerging with militaries, and the first wars are happening. And all this happens since ancient China and Egypt. There exist harsh inequalities between slaves and free men, nobility and non-nobility, men and women. Maria Stavrinaki, who has written some of you I annoyed already with this really amazing book called Transfixed by Prehistory, has argued that this also entailed, I quote, a rupture between the naturalistic forms of the Paleolithic and the schematism, even abstraction, of the Neolithic, between a worldview to be monistic and another that was supposedly dualistic, between a hunting economy and an economy based on the domestication of plants and animals. All the changes broke with immediate nature. Now, this makes potentially more evident why contemporary societies are still societies that correspond to societies of the Neolithic type. And hence there's a certain continuity that Badiou sees with the past. So you see that's a reactualization of Marx's claim that the past determines the present. And maybe one could venture to claim that we're not only living in the future, but precisely that we're living in the past. Private property, family with hereditary transmission of property, and the state are the three pillars that Badiou identifies as most crucial determinants of the Neolithic framework, and the inequalities that exist within the Neolithic framework are symptomatic products of this very organization. So Badiou's argument is that if the form of appearance of the Neolithic age is determined by severe types of inequalities, and we're living in a world where we can detect even potentially harsher inequalities than ever, and we can detect similar conditions, then one can venture and risk the claim that these societies must still be Neolithic. Gabriel de Mortillet, who wrote a book in the late 19th century called Le Préhistorique, Antiquité de l'Homme, therefore, I think, suggested, and I think in absolute line with Badiou's argument, that one should speak of the Neolithic contemporary man. But I think the second part of the argument is now that because Neolithic societies were not always per se global, but capitalism has been global, or at least become global, we can talk about this, the global principle of organizing sociality, we're now in a kind of global Neolithic age. So Badiou, I think, here looks at history in such a way that he seeks to understand history as a locus for potential events, and he wants to determine what are the features, what are the characteristics, what are the defining points that allow us to imagine a potential event that would actually transform something and be a historical event, bring back history. And the claim, I mean, as you can see, what needs to concern these principles that he detects as being determinants for the Neolithic age. So it would be formally determined by all the things that appeared and throughout history appeared impossible to transform. Why? Because one can say, how do we find these principles? Not simply by looking what remains stable throughout history, but by looking what presented itself as an obstacle, as an impossibility to change in any attempt to change anything whatsoever. Right? So we have almost like a dual history, where we have history laying bare the very conditions of historical transformation through an indication, a historically specific indication of what remained impossible to change. This is why he looks at problems occurring, specific problems occurring, from the Spartacus rebellion to the French and Haitian Revolution, to the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution, and so forth. Because in the long history of these revolutions, certain very particular points emerged as shared points of impossibility. Revolutions are attempted emancipations, all came up against roadblocks, against something that resisted changing, and almost negatively, but increasingly crystallized and made identifiable, intelligible, these three components that are constitutive of a prehistoric Neolithic formation as we know it. That is what you claim. So this is what the critique of the political economy of capitalist prehistory looks like. It can be, I think, reduced to one demand. And it's still the same demand that one finds in the Communist Manifesto. The demand to abolish private property. From which is inferred the form of family that only exists on the ground of this principle, and hence only exists for the hereditary transmission of private property, and from which one can infer all the institutions that only exist to protect the very existence of private property. This is what the history of working through, or working against and through the automatic subject, that is capital, that I think for Badiou, I'm just saying that as an aside, is an obscure subject. Because obscure subjects attempt to undo the very possibility of history. And in this sense, I think an obscure subject, capitalism is an obscure subject. But this is what the history of working against and through the workings of the automatic subject, that is capital, can bring to the forth. I mean, it brings to the forth what constitutes the essential features of the maneuvers of producing the absorption of historical time. In the end, I mean, as you know, because I just said so, and maybe you just know, as the Communist Manifesto claims, all the communist demands can be reduced to one: the abolishment of private property. And I would also bet that's not the worst path if there is an attempt to exit prehistory. Thank you.